Hello fellow Clashers, this is Kairos Time and welcome to another strategy guide to Clash Royale. Today we're going to be doing a guide on counting cards for dummies. If you haven't already checked out my previous strategy guides to Clash Royale, make sure you do so. There's a link to them in the description below. In today's video, we're going to be talking about card rotation basics. We're going to talk about specifically how to count cards, talk about some tips and tricks on how you can improve your gameplay overall, as well as show you some actual gameplay that I'm going to commentate and explain kind of the thought process that I have when it comes to keeping track of what cards are in your opponent's hand. Other than your starting card rotation, the rotation of your cards is not random. Every time you play a card from your hand, it goes to the back of your deck, and then as you draw cards from the top of your deck, it will slowly make its way to the top of the deck and then make it back into your hand. Because the rotation is not random, you could theoretically completely know exactly which cards are in your opponent's hand if you were able to keep a track of their card order as well as how many cards they've played since every single one of their cards. It would take a literal super genius for you to be able to know all of that and keep track of all of that with just your memory. But there are some principles that can be found within there that will help any player get better at the game. For example, let's go ahead and take a look at this goblin. Let's say you play the goblins onto the field, the skeletons move into your hand, and the goblins get put into the back of your deck. As you play the skeletons, the bats move back into your hand from the top of your deck, the skeletons move to the back, and the goblins are one step closer to being back into your hand. At this point, we have played one card after the goblins. Playing the Ice Spirit next, the Spirit Goblins move into your hand, and your goblin is one step closer to being at the top of your deck. Now we've played two cards since playing the goblins. The cycle continues as we play the minions and the archers move into your hand, and then as we play the bats and those goblins make it back into your hand. After you've played those four cards after the goblins will be back into your hand. If you're like my friend the barbarian and this seems a little difficult to understand at first, don't worry, it gets easier with practice. Let's say you're playing deck number 1 and your opponent is playing deck number 2. By counting cards, you're going to be able to make sure that you always have the right cards to counter your opponent's threats as well as their defenses. On the flip side of things, you can also keep track of which cards are in your opponent's hands so that you can try and play around them and not be taken out by their defenses. I've talked about how a super genius would be able to completely know what is in their opponent's hand by keeping track of every card, the order of each of the cards, as well as how many cards has been played since the previous card. Now let's be realistic. The average person can store about 5 pieces of information in their mind for about 15 seconds. This is how short-term memory works. Your opponent has 8 cards in their hand. You want to try and remember all of those, as well as the order in which they've been played. Try to form a strategy all while trying to counter your opponent's cards. That's a lot of information to keep track of, and even if you could keep track of all of that, you're going to forget it because 10 elixir takes about 14 seconds to get in 2 times elixir. So even after you've played a few cards, it's still likely that your opponent still hasn't completed their cycle and your mind is likely to forget the information that you've already tried to store. With all that being said, if you try and keep track of everything, you're likely to get carried away. But there are some tips and strategies that will help you know which cards are in your opponent's hand without having to count every one of their cards. The first step in knowing which cards are in your opponent's hand is to flag key cards. When I say key cards, I'm talking about cards that are either going to be good counters to your cards or are going to be threats if you don't have a response. You'll want to start off by just flagging 1 card per deck and then maybe move to 2, and if you can get really good, then move on to 3 or 4. For example, let's say you have the Hog Rider in your deck and the Goblin Gang is in your opponent's, which does a pretty good job of countering your Hog Rider if you do not have a response to it. As soon as you see that Goblin Gang, you should flag it so that you can try and make sure that you have a response the next time you see it. For example, having the log in your hand so you can counter the Goblin Gang when they have it, so your Hog Rider can get some damage on the tower. Now that you've flagged a card or 2, the next step is counting. Like I said, this is easier said than done, but with a little bit of a practice, you'll be able to get this down and make it pretty much second nature. In this situation, I have the P.E.K.K.A going down the lane and my opponent is defending with an Inferno Dragon. Obviously, the next best move is to try and place down that Battle Ram so that the Inferno Dragon won't take out my P.E.K.K.A, and hopefully I can get some damage on the enemy tower. My opponent is going to respond with a Skeleton Army, which is a key card. We'll go ahead and watch this as it comes. I'm going to be playing these cards, but as soon as I see that Skeleton Army, I flag that as a key card so that I can start counting afterwards. I go ahead and zap it so I can try and get some damage. My opponent plays a Mega Minion, which is 1 card. Then, after I've gotten a little bit closer there, he does end up playing the Goblin Gang, which is the 2nd card. We're just down to 2 cards, which is not too hard to keep track of. The next is the third card, which is actually going to end up being the zap, which is he is going to zap my baby dragon. And now I'm waiting. We're both kind of low on elixir, so I'm not too concerned at the moment. He's not going to be placing cards too quickly, but I do just have to remember that there are 3 cards that he's already played. It takes about 10 to 15 seconds for you to forget that short-term memory information, and so you have to just sit there and remember, okay, 3 cards, 3 cards. He then plays the Lava Hound, and because I know that is the 4th card, I place the Battle Ram and then the poison, so as soon as that skeleton army gets put down, my Battle Ram makes it to the tower, and I claim that victory. While actually counting your opponent's cards is going to help you know exactly if your opponent has a card in their hand, looking for patterns is a much easier way to have a really good idea of what is in their hand. Because there are only 8 cards in your deck, it's very likely for you and your opponent to be playing in very similar manners. You're going to be able to see a lot of patterns that are going to happen as you play against each other. For example, sometimes people will even be caught up in a specific cycle. Let's say you play a Hog Rider and your opponent responds with the Goblin Gang. Because they respond with the Goblin Gang, the next step is obviously to send the log in and get rid of them. Because you've sent in the log, your opponent then plays the Goblin Barrel, which you respond with your own Goblin Gang. Your opponent then zaps that Goblin Gang, and so you go ahead and try and build up some type of a push by putting the minions in the back, maybe try and cycle back to your Hog Rider, and they respond with a Princess. You decide to wait until the Princess is at the bridge and play against that with the Knight, to which they respond to with the Skeletons. Now that you've completed this cycle, your opponent is ready to play the Hog Rider and the cycle continues again. Please understand that this does not happen in every match. This is just an example of what could happen and what does happen in a lot of matches. But there are some important principles that we can learn from this model. One pattern to recognize from this specific situation is that whenever your opponent plays the Goblin Gang, you can expect that they have a Goblin Barrel ready, so you should be ready as well. In addition, if your opponent plays the Skeletons, you know that they likely have the Goblin Gang in their hand and ready to defend against your Hog Rider without actually having to count for those cards. Because of how our brain works with information, we can recognize patterns a lot easier than we can just store straight information. Because of that, this is going to be a much easier way for you to be able to know what cards are in your opponent's hand if you are looking for those patterns and recognizing them. That being said, the only way for you to know exactly what is in your opponent's hand is to count cards. Another technique that we can learn from this model is by using your own hand as a guide to what is in your opponent's hand. In this situation, if you have the Hog Rider in your hand, it's likely that your opponent has the Goblin Gang in their hand if you're playing at a similar pace as your opponent. You would obviously also know that if you do have the log in your hand, that it's likely that they have the Goblin Barrel, which means that you should save that log for the Goblin Barrel and not for something less threatening like a Princess. As far as tips and tricks goes, the first big tip that I have is practice. I know that it goes without saying, but any skill will get better as you practice it, and that requires effort, especially in such a complex strategy game. The more you do it, the more you're going to feel more comfortable with it, and you're going to start to be able to get a really good sense of when your opponent is likely to play certain cards, almost as if by second nature. Another suggestion that I have is to try and break your cycle. If you and your opponent are playing in a cycle like that and their deck is doing a better job at countering yours, it's a really good idea for you to try and break that cycle and play a little bit less predictively. One other really big suggestion that I have is to try and play around flagged cards. What I mean by that is not playing a card that your opponent has an obvious counter to. For example, if you have the Goblin Gang and your opponent has the log, just don't play the Goblin Gang until after they've played the log. It can take a little bit to try and keep that Goblin Gang in your hand, but you're going to be able to gain the advantage if you wait until they make the mistake first. One other tip that I did want to mention is the draw delay. There's actually a delay in time between when you can draw cards. In 1 times Elixir, it takes 2 seconds for the next card to actually enter into your hand, and in 2 times Elixir, it takes 1 second. This doesn't play that big of a role in a lot of gameplay, but it does make a difference if you're trying to cycle to another card very quickly. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a match, and I'm going to do my absolute best to explain the kind of thought process that I have while I'm playing the game in order to understand what cards are in my opponent's hand. Here's a little bit of a graphic to try and fully understand exactly what's going on here. So here at the very beginning, obviously the first thing that I'm thinking about is just waiting until my opponent is playing a card because I don't have a really great opening card to play out there. He goes ahead and plays the bowler. The bowler isn't really a big threat and it's not really a great defense against my type of deck that I have here, so I'm not going to flag him as a specific card. I didn't have a great response to the bowler, so I placed down the baby dragon as to not try and waste elixir. He plays down the Electro Wizard and I put my bandit. Once again, I'm just trying to wait and see exactly what he's going to do. Now at this point, I end up actually placing down the P.E.K.K.A. just barely after he plays down the Elite Barbarians, which are definitely a threat to my tower. As such, I flag them in my memory to try and remember a little bit about when they're going to be there, and also recognize that the Rage and Elite Barbarian is a pattern that I do want to be aware of if he does happen to do that in the future, so I don't lose a tower like I did in this type of situation. At this point, I'm building up a pretty nice P.E.K.K.A. push, and he plays down the Inferno Tower, which is definitely a flagged card because it does such a great job at countering my P.E.K.K.A. I want to try and count the cards after he plays the Inferno Tower because I'm really going to need some good offensive power to try and get over the fact that I did already lose a tower. As such, he's played the Electro Wizard, which is one card, and here he plays another card, the Fireball. At this point, my main goal, honestly, is to just try to remember how many cards until he is going to have the Inferno Tower back into his hand. When both you and your opponent are building up elixir like this, it's really easy for you to forget things because of how our short-term memory works. That's a great time to really focus on just counting cards. I know that he's about to place another card. He plays down the bowler, which is a third card, and all I have to do is just wait until he plays one more card. He ends up placing down the Ice Spirit to cycle back to his Inferno Tower, and that is my cue to try and do something to distract that Inferno Tower so it does not take out my P.E.K.K.A. It works out pretty well, but now that I've played the Goblin Gang around when he's played his Inferno Tower, I can actually stop counting the Inferno Tower and just pay attention to when I have the Goblin Gang back in my hand. Now that it's back in my hand, I do know that his Inferno Tower is coming up soon, but probably not immediately because I have been playing a little bit quicker than he has been. Now that I'm to the point where I can actually just poison and zap his tower to get rid of it, I'm not concerned about the Inferno Tower and I'm more concerned about the Elite Barbarian. It's been quite a while since he's played the Elite Barbarian Rage combination, and so I did get caught off guard just a little bit at this point, but I'm not going to let that happen and decide to start counting those Elite Barbarians. That was the third card that he's played since the Elite Barbarian, and that was the fourth. So I know that he has the Elite Barbarian in his hand, and what I need to do is actually defend against it. Now, I know I'm going to be able to stop this, but I do need to make sure that I can stop the next push afterwards, because that's going to be the key difference between me winning and losing. He's played 2 cards since the Elite Barbarians, so I'm waiting for 2 more. He ends up placing that bowler, which brings that up to 3, and then he plays the Electro Wizard. I now know that he has the Elite Barbarians in his hand, and as soon as he has enough elixir, he's most likely going to go for a rush if he can. He's forced to actually defend with that Inferno Tower, and rather than going for a push in the left-hand lane, I know that I need to stop that Elite Barbarian, so what do? I go ahead and put the Battle Ram in the right-hand lane so that there's no way he's going to be able to make it to the tower before I'm able to cycle back to my poison and my zap. Hopefully this gives you a good understanding of why flagging cards, counting for them, and also looking for patterns is going to help you understand what kind of cards are in your opponent's deck. If you're like most people and haven't tried learning these types of practices, it's going to seem really confusing and complex at first, but as you practice it, like I said, it simply becomes second nature. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this strategy guide and you haven't seen my previous ones, make sure you do so. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave it in the comment section below. I'm going to respond to every single positive comment that is posted in the first day of this video, so you won't be missed. For now, this is Kairos time ticking by, and we will see you in the arena.